But if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the rule, and this they will do.
Everything out of the ordinary is to be reported.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
That's an interesting picture. It was a church. Do you know that word? Yes, there were still churches when I was a child.
You know, there was a time in human history when God and the hand of science were the same.
MK Ultra mind control rules in Hollywood. If you don't know, Google that and look into it.
Some of the names of criminals is hardly informing.
They're not criminals, Lusala. They're patriots.
Patriots!
Like patriots!
You're listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us here once again on Beyond Extraordinary. I'm Natalina, and I'm coming to you from my own little slice of paradise in western Minnesota. So far west, in fact, that to invoke a little bit of Sarah Palin, I can literally see North Dakota from my house. And that's no lie. I live right snuggle up on the bank of the Red River, and the Red River sort of serves as a border between the two states. And I'm only Minnesotan by default. I'm Minnesotan because we happened to find an apartment on the Minnesota side of the river. But I spent the majority of my life, well, all of my life, living in North Dakota up until moving into this apartment in Minnesota. But it is beautiful all the way around, whether you're in Minnesota or North Dakota. It's just beautiful country up here. And I feel so blessed, especially in the summertime when I can see the green trees and the green grass. And we're going to be going on a trip next week to go visit my parents in North Dakota in my hometown. And one of the wonderful things about North Dakota that's probably somewhat unique to a lot of other states in the country is that you can drive for hundreds of miles in North Dakota and see nothing but prairie. You know, you can just drive and drive and drive and not hit another town or not hit another town to speak of. I mean, you know, there are lots of little towns and communities that dot the interstate, but they're little farming communities and you know, not bustling metropolises by any stretch of the imagination. And you can just drive, you know, it's about 300 miles from where I live now to where my parents live, and almost the entire stretch, with a very few exceptions, there's about 3 towns that you pass through or pass by in between. It's really just prairie. And I used to find it so incredibly boring, you know, boring landscape, boring scenery, lots of cows, or cattle, I guess is the appropriate way to say it. But nothing, I always thought, well, there's nothing to look at. Well, first of all, that's kind of beautiful in and of itself, just rolling prairie. You know, there are parts of North Dakota that look no different now than they did when Europeans first came here. It's a really lovely place to live. And of course now we have the oil boom going on in North Dakota with the Bakken oil field, and so it's brought a lot more people here. North Dakota has a very booming economy right now, and we've got lots of jobs, unlike most of the rest of the country. So it's a wonderful place to come and live. But in some ways, I think those of us who have lived here in this area our whole lives are a little bit sad to see the changes that come along with a booming economy. North Dakota has always been fine. You know, we've had our agriculture and a little bit of our industry, but we've always been a little bit isolated. You know, we've often been referred to as flyover country, and we always kind of like it that way, you know. And that's kind of becoming a thing of the past. So, you know, I'm happy for my state that it's doing so well economically, but in some ways you start to worry that some of the things that you love so much about the state, which is that it is a quiet and lovely and peaceful place, that starts to be threatened as the population grows. But nonetheless, as it currently stands, it's a wonderful place to live. I highly recommend it. And I love to just go out in the summertime and stand on the banks of the Red River, or when I'm in my hometown, stand on the banks of the Missouri River and take pictures. Although I did something really dumb this week. I had this wonderful camera that I had been saving my pennies for, and I purchased it, and it was kind of fancy for me. I'm kind of a point and click kind of gal, but it took the most beautiful, wonderful pictures, and I kind of fancy myself to be an amateur photographer. But I threw it in the washing machine, and I washed it along with my laundry. Needless to say, it doesn't work anymore, and I'm really bummed about that. So now I have to start all over, saving my pennies, to buy myself a new camera. Because I'm really not fancy when it comes to technology. I realize that some people may think, because I like to help build websites and doing podcasts and working on my own site and spending a lot of time online, people might think that I'm tech savvy. I am not. I still have a primitive old phone. I've never had a smartphone. My phone does not have any bells and whistles. In fact, it's old. If I were to go into the place that I have my contract through right now, they would probably almost insist that I upgrade, because this thing is ancient, but I'm just so used to it. I'm such a creature of habit, and I'm afraid to learn how to use a smartphone. I have no idea. But the thing with my phone is that it has a really crappy camera on it. That's the downside. And so it doesn't really serve as a good substitute for the fancy camera that is very clean but very dead at this point. So in any case, I'm really glad you're listening tonight. We had a really great response to the last episode of Beyond Extraordinary, which kind of surprised me, because the show was just me, just talking. And but we had a great response. I got a lot of really good feedback, and it was very encouraging. So I want to thank everyone for listening, and I want to really thank everyone for tuning in tonight to episode 2, because I think it's going to be a really, really important episode that you might even want to listen to a few times. Our guest tonight is Cris Putnam, and he's an author, and he's a Christian apologist, and he has a really great ministry. And during the first part of the show, he's going to talk about his books and his research into it's a great show if you're into UFOs, if you're into, Vatican intrigue and conspiracy and mystery, all of that. There's a little bit of all of that in the first part of the show. And then in the second part of the show, we're going to be discussing some questions, some actually submitted questions that come from people who are non-Christians, non-believers, or maybe even just seekers, questioners, that were specifically submitted in an effort to have someone who does have the credentials of a Christian apologist and a theologian and biblical scholar to tackle these questions. And they're tough questions. And Cris has agreed to take them on and defend the faith. And so it's a really great show for you if you're a non-believer, because he's going to be addressing questions that have probably really been troubling you or have been really weighing on your mind. And then it's also going to be a really good show for believers, because, as hard as we try, there are some questions that people put to us that we have a hard time answering, or at least answering in a sort of succinct way. Not all of us are theologians. Not all of us are biblical scholars. And while we do an okay job, maybe a lot of times it's only, for me anyway, I guess I can only speak for myself, but a lot of times it's only in retrospect where I think, oh man, I should have said this, I should have said that, And, it's very important that we are able to answer these questions that are brought to us. And that was a lesson that I learned very clearly in this past week or so when my discussion group had a number of people join who were non-believers or people who had opposing viewpoints. And it got a little hairy for a while there in the group. There was a lot of discussion and there was a lot of bickering and arguing and tensions were running high and this type of thing. And ultimately the decision was made to just let these arguments and disagreements happen because, when I believe that when these questions are brought to us, if they are brought to us in a sincerely questioning way, or even in a sort of challenging way, but with good behavior, we'll put it that way, then I think we should be able to address these questions. We should at least try, because in some ways that is what we're called to do. And I know that for myself personally, one who was rather rebellious at one time against all things Christianity, it wasn't until someone took the time to explain some biblical truths in detail that my heart started to open to at least not rejecting it outright. And it is a process, but I guarantee you, coming from someone who knows, that a lot of times it isn't immediately evident. But the things that you're saying to people, and especially if you're coming from a place of reason and logic, which a lot of people assume Christians can't do, by the way, and unfortunately we're sometimes our own worst enemy in that regard. But when you approach them in such a way, it does find a home, and maybe it finds a home in their heart, or maybe it finds a home in the deepest, darkest recesses of their brain. But I guarantee you, at some point, it's going to come back out and into the front of their mind, and they're going to think about it. And if they are intellectually honest, they're going to realize that you did make a very good point. All of that to say that I think this is the kind of show you're going to want to share, and you're going to want to maybe even take notes, whether it is that you are someone who wants to learn how to better defend the faith, or someone who wants to learn, quite frankly, how to challenge the faith. Both people are here to learn, hopefully. And so I'm really glad that you decided to listen tonight. And I hope that you definitely hit us with some follow-up questions after you listen. It's really, really good. It's really going to be a good, honest discussion. So again, I thank you so much for listening, and I want you to listen to the whole thing, and I also want you to take a look at the show notes, because Cris is going to hit us with a lot of information, and there's going to be a lot of corresponding sources that we're going to share, and you'll find I'll do my best to put as many of those sources in the show notes as possible so that you can do further research on your own. And so let's just jump right into it, all right? And then I want you to stick around, because after the interview, I'm going to just sort of wrap up, and I have a few other things that I would like to announce and discuss with you. So here we go. Earlier this year, the world was stunned as Pope Benedict XVI announced his resignation as the Supreme Pontiff. A papal resignation is something that no one had seen in centuries. So while the media was buzzing about this shocking event, those familiar with the work of Cris Putnam and Tom Horn were somewhat expecting it. In their best-selling book Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, Putnam and Horn explored an ancient prophecy that predicted with startling accuracy the line of popes through time right up until the current pope. So if St. Malachi's prophecy of the popes is to be believed, Pope Francis is Petrus Romanus, the final pope. And in their latest work, Cris Putnam and Tom Horn dig deeper into Vatican secrecy, revealing an incredible connection between the Catholic Church and the UFO phenomena. So it's right up our alley here at Extraordinary Intelligence. I'm really super duper excited to welcome author Cris Putnam to Beyond Extraordinary. So Cris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Hey, Natalina, it's an honor to be on the show with you. Thank you for having me.
Sure. I'm really excited. We've got a few things to do in the next hour or so, but the first burning question I have for you is, with all of the research that you've done, particularly with regard to Petrus Romanus, did you expect someone like Bergoglio to become the new pope? Does he line up with who you anticipated Petrus Romanus might be?
Well, I think he kind of caught us by surprise. I didn't really have him on a short list of any sort, but I'm not too shocked in some regard, because the fact that he is the first Jesuit pope has really brought up a lot of interesting ideas and suggestions. It kind of actually formed a bridge between the book Petrus Romanus and the book Exo-Vaticana that turned out to be quite interesting. So, yeah, he kind of caught me off guard in that I didn't really have him personally listed, but on further reflection, he does seem like he is a good candidate for this final pope that they talk about.
Right, and he's even a lot of the things that he's said thus far kind of play into that, particularly with his recent statements that even atheists could be included in salvation, and it kind of makes you wonder, is he really setting himself up to be that sort of almost false prophet? Do you think Petrus Romanus is or could be the false prophet of biblical prophecy?
Well, that was the underlying thesis of the book Petrus Romanus, and it's really just based on, in the book of Revelation, it describes this false prophet in apocalyptic symbolism, but it says he has horns like a lamb, yet speaks like a dragon. And just that phrase, horns like a lamb. Horns are typically a sign of power, a symbol for power. Like a bull's horns, things like that. So usually when you see, in symbolic language, horns signify power. So like a lamb is pretty transparently saying that he's seen as a Christian, I think. Jesus is the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world in the Gospels. So horns like a lamb. I think from that, it's not a huge stretch to think that perhaps this false prophet is seen as a powerful Christian leader. And if you were going to ask the world who that would be, I'm sure that the Pope would probably be the number one pick.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you mentioned that the work that you did with Petrus Romanus with Tom Horn transitioned into your latest book, Exo-Vaticana. Now, one thing, you and Tom Horn don't mess around. You write big books. So they're probably a little difficult to summarize, but could you give us a bit of an overview of what Exo-Vaticana is about?
Well, Exo-Vaticana kind of grew out of Petrus Romanus, in which, in Petrus Romanus, I kind of addressed church history issues and theology, what the issues are between Protestants and Catholics, and why we don't think the papacy meets its claim as the sole representative of the one true church. And, a lot of people raised questions after, that book. Well, what do you make of all these statements that the Vatican has been making about extraterrestrials? Because they have been making them. I would challenge the listeners just to do a Google search on the two terms baptized extraterrestrial, and what you'll see are all sorts of articles by these Jesuit astronomers who work for the Vatican who have gone out in the media and talked about baptizing extraterrestrials. They've given many interviews, and many of them have said this. So it wasn't just something that, we just kind of made up or were interested in. It's something they have actually been out in the media kind of promoting their interest in this. And then, it's also just an interesting question, why is the Catholic Church maintaining a state-of-the-art observatory on the top of a mountain in Arizona, which just happens to be next to the most powerful telescope in the world? These are interesting questions, and there's been a number of things said about them over the years. Malachi Martin, when interviewed by Art Bell in the late 90s, said something to the effect that they were expecting something, that something was heading this way that they were watching for, and that's what they were doing up there. So he seems to be a highly placed insider, so that's an interesting suggestion, that they're actually watching for something coming this way. Now, he didn't say what it was. So people were asking us what we made of all this, so we decided to look into it, given our hypothesis that the Catholic Church could probably play a major role in a kind of ecumenical one-world faith that we see predicted in biblical prophecy. Now, I actually wrote a paper in seminary and, kind of ran some of my ideas through a PhD theologian who actually gave me high marks on the idea that the question of aliens and extraterrestrials really has a lot of explanatory scope for explaining how such a world that we have as today, where people have so many divergent beliefs, and you think about Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Christians and all these people of, really radically different worldviews, and not to mention secularists who are becoming quite a voice in Western culture, in the atheists, that all look to science as the only arbiter of truth. What could possibly unite all these divergent groups of people where they actually all believe someone's claimed to be a deity, and they buy into this system? And this is what the prophecies predict. 2 Thessalonians 2 says that this fellow, the man of sin or the Antichrist, is actually going to claim to be God, and the world is going to worship him. That's kind of hard to fathom, given the multicultural perspective that we have, that all these divergent groups are actually going to buy into this. Now, the one thing that I can think of that would pull people from every group and unite them would be some sort of otherworldly or extraterrestrial claim. And so for that reason, that's kind of our hypothesis, that perhaps this is the thing that really does unite everyone when they see something from outside of this world. It would have the tendency to bring everyone in the world together. And even Ronald Reagan remarked on that famously at the United Nations. And in several speeches, he mentioned how quickly our differences would be diminished if we were faced with an alien threat from outside of this world. That's pretty much a quote from Reagan at the UN. So, it's not a terribly novel idea to think of that, and science fiction has been playing around with that idea for a long time, but I think it does offer a lot of explanatory scope of how things could fall into place very quickly.
And it seems to be something that's on everyone's mind, whether they are people of faith or as they're coming at it from a strictly secular point of view. The UFO issue is something that most everyone is thinking about. So I think this book goes a long way to explaining what some of that could be about. And, the two of you didn't just research this from afar. You really actually went up to the Vatican Observatory and spoke to the people that were there. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, that was quite interesting. It's out in the middle of the desert, about an hour outside of Tucson. And Tom and I ventured up there, and we did get to tour the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, and then a couple hundred yards from that is what they call the sub-millimeter radio telescope, which is a large dish. And then just, it's kind of a little complex. It's probably not much bigger than a half mile total. Right next to that is the large binocular telescope, and that is the most powerful telescope in the world. They say that they have clearer images there than even the Hubble Space Telescope, because it actually uses two huge mirrors. And the University of Arizona actually pioneered a new way of making mirrors. And with telescope power, the size of the mirror is really what dictates how powerful it is. So the Vatican telescope actually got the first mirror out of that mirror lab in Arizona, and that's the VAT. And it's pretty big, but the LBT actually has two huge mirrors, and they really are using that. Really, the main mission of that facility is the search for exoplanets and the search for life in space. So that's truly their mission statement at the LBT. And of course, that's also the instrument that has the diabolic name of the Lucifer instrument, which is attached to the LBT. And that that's kind of a really strained acronym that stands for Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research.
Wow.
But it sounds to me like somebody went to pretty exorbitant lengths to, derive the name Lucifer. But that's what they ended up with. And it looks like it was the Max Planck Institute that actually named that Lucifer. And they credit that to the name of a German politician who actually appropriated the funding for them to get involved in the project. And apparently his last name in German literally means devil. So they wanted to name it to honor him.
Wow.
Which is a pretty interesting turn of events. But yeah, one way or the other, they are up on Mount Graham with an instrument named Lucifer looking for aliens.
Oh my goodness. That's going to come as a shock to a lot of people who, if they're not familiar with what the Vatican and what the Catholic hierarchy is getting themselves up to. I mean, it just seems like, why would they be interested? But when you read Exo-Vaticana, it all comes together and you figure it out. And in your book, you name names. I mean, there are plenty of quotes from high-ranking Vatican officials. Have you received any blowback from some of these people since the book came out?
Yeah, we have, actually. Brother Guy Cosmonalgo, who's one of the Jesuit astronomers, he had some objections to the way some of his writing was represented. He claimed that the Vatican has no UFO secrets. We don't know anything about this. These were all just things that he was speculating about. He actually wrote a book for Catholics and about the belief in extraterrestrials. And, he said a lot of things, and he's one of these people that's really skillful at putting a question mark at the end of all of his statements so that, it's just a question. But there's always some implications involved in the sorts of questions he's asking. For instance, I'll read one for you, and you can make up your own mind whether he's suggesting something that is alien to what most Christians would want to be thinking about. Here he says, perhaps it's not so far-fetched to see the second person of the Trinity, the Word, who was present in the beginning, John 1:1, coming to lay down his life and take it up again. He cites John 10:18, not only as the Son of Man, but also as a child of other races, ? So, yeah, the question mark gets you out of any, accountability for suggesting that Jesus might have died for aliens. And that's kind of what he's shooting for. And he even talks about the biblical Nephilim as possibly an oblique reference to some sort of extraterrestrials. And then he says things like, well, whether you interpret these as angels or aliens, it doesn't really matter for the sake of our argument here, but that the Bible was really happy with talking about other intelligent beings. So he kind of uses the Nephilim as some kind of rationale for believing in ETs, which is really hard for me to imagine, given that those are the giants who were the enemies of the Israelites in the Old Testament. I don't know how he got the ET inference there, but yeah, he's pretty cavalier about throwing those ideas around, but then he got really upset with the way his interview turned out, because he was interviewed in our book. And, one of his big things was there are no Vatican UFO secrets. Well, the attorney for the Jesuit order, Sheehan, actually testified at that recent disclosure hearing in Washington, D.C., that he petitioned the Vatican for their UFO records under the authority of President Carter. In the late 70s, and they actually not only returned it down, they turned down President Carter. So they absolutely do have records that they're hiding and they won't let anyone see. It's not much of a stretch to assume that they would have records of these sorts of things. I mean, after all, it's probably the oldest running bureaucracy in history, and they have an express mission to go out and investigate anomalous phenomenon. They go out and investigate Marian apparitions and any kind of strange supernatural events. They have a team of people that actually go and look at these things. So, for him to claim that there are no Vatican UFO secrets is a pretty dubious claim right on the face of it. This is the same guy that's going out in the media and saying things that he would baptize an extraterrestrial no matter how many tentacles it has, things like that. So I mean, it's really hard to take him seriously when he denies any knowledge of any of these things.
Right, I agree. And when I'm looking at Exo-Vaticana, and I received the book a number of months ago, and there's just a lot of information in it, and I've just had to go over and reread some portions, and it doesn't just deal with the Vatican UFO connection. I mean, it goes into the UFO question at large, including, abduction cases and sightings and this type of thing. So, Chris, if I had to put you on the spot and ask you to give me, with all the research you've done and the evidence that is available right now, what your hypothesis as to what UFOs truly are, what the nature of a UFO is, how would you answer that question?
Okay, well, first, you have to sort of narrow down what you mean when you say UFO, because that can be a lot of different things. It's not all necessarily the same thing because it's just unidentified, right? And so I kind of introduced this concept that an astrophysicist named Hugh Ross has written about called the RUFO, meaning residual UFO. And this is just based on the idea that, once you kind of narrow it down and get rid of all the hoaxes and misidentifications, there's somewhere between 5 and 10% of these cases that really are something interesting. They really are, something unexplained. And so when you're dealing, once you narrow it down to that, what do I think we're dealing with? Well, my main hypothesis is in the chapter in the book called The Powers and Principalities Planetary Control System. And what I did with that, I read a lot of Jacques Vallée's books. He's one of the ufologists that I have a lot of respect for, not in that I necessarily share his worldview, but he's just one of the more qualified people that's looked at the phenomenon for a long time. He's got a master's degree in astrophysics and a PhD in computer science. He was working on Project Blue Book with J. Allen Hynek in the 1960s. So he's been following the phenomenon for decades. He does not think it's extraterrestrials. He thinks that it is something close by that's always been here, that has, explains a lot of our old mythology, a lot of ideas about the little people and some of the demonic stories that we see in the Middle Ages. There's a lot of parallels between a lot of classical literature and abduction literature, even when it comes to the tales of incubus and succubus demons. So Vallée views it as a phenomenon that's always been around, influencing our culture, influencing people's worldviews. And, when you look at the New Testament and you see that Paul talks about these powers and principalities, their battle is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual wickedness in high places. In the book of Ephesians, he talks about the prince of the power of the air. Now, I did go into some discussion of that title. It's a title for Satan, for the devil. And interestingly, if you do some research into what first century Jews in the New Testament era believed about the demonic realm, the demonic realm was really the atmosphere above the earth, between the earth and the moon. So it shouldn't be all that shocking that we see various strange aerial phenomenon in our skies, if this is really the realm of the demons. And I think that that's what we're seeing a lot of times. And so Vallée has even written a book called Messengers of Deception. He's picked up on the fact that these entities go out of their way to deceive people. And, Christian commentators who look into this phenomenon invariably notice that they seem to go out of their way to undermine the Christian story. Not so much on Eastern religions. They seem to promote those ideas, but they're really keen on attacking Jesus and the gospel idea. So I think that is suggestive that we are dealing with demonic entities who are sort of kind of using this alien guise as their camouflage while influencing worldviews. Now, I think just the belief that aliens are visiting the Earth is a powerful enough belief to undermine a lot of people's worldview in ways that they don't even consider. Because, if you look at astrobiology and the assumptions involved, really the way astrobiology, that this study of life in space, it is based on naturalistic assumptions, mainly that, if you have a planet in the right place with the right temperature, with a little bit of water, that life just kind of evolves, out of nothing, and just intelligent beings will arise just by naturalistic processes. So based on those assumptions, they kind of assume that the universe is teeming with life. And, then it's not so hard to extrapolate that maybe some of them are visiting us. But, in assuming that, you've already kind of given up the idea that we were created by God, that humanity is special. In fact, you're kind of conceding that there might be beings that are superior to us that just evolved on their own. And so doing this, it goes a long way of undermining the biblical worldview without ever really even addressing it specifically. Just some of the things that are assumed in this belief have that effect. So, just by perpetrating the idea that UFOs are alien spaceships flying around the Earth, it goes a long way to accomplishing the goal of undermining the Christian message just by itself.
I agree, and I've been studying the UFO phenomenon for years, probably really been interested in it since I was a little girl, and particularly with Extraordinary Intelligence, I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of people who do approach the UFO thing from a secular worldview. And one thing that I've found really interesting is some people that I interviewed early on who were very much believing that the UFO phenomena was a physical sort of extraterrestrial type of, that's where these sightings were coming from, have actually started to shift their focus a bit. And in personal conversations, I even spoke to one of the people who was one of the cast members of UFO Hunters, and he told me that after UFO Hunters finished filming and he had time to reflect on this, his beliefs are a lot more in line with Jacques Vallée as to that there has to be a spiritual component to what's happening here. I find that really interesting. It seems like the deeper people get into it, they have to start to account for the fact that there is something more going on. And now, in Exo-Vaticana, there's a really great section that addresses, does ET disclosure threaten Christianity? And you focus in on this report that NASA put out in the 60s, the Brookings report. And in that report, largely is probably where the idea that if there were to be disclosure, in quotes, at some point, that this would throw people of faith into a whirlwind, that all of a sudden they would just be questioning their faith and that type of thing. And it even specifically refers to people of faith as probably illiterate and semi-illiterate people. So obviously doesn't take much intellectual standing into account. And that transitions us nicely into the next part of this interview, which is we put out a call for people to send in questions about Christianity at large, things that had been bothering them about the Bible, things that they couldn't quite wrap their heads around, whether they are coming at it from another faith or whether they were atheists or secular humanists or whatever. And I asked them, please send in some questions for Cris Putnam, because I believe he is the guy who could probably answer these questions certainly better than I could. So let's put this theory that Christians are illiterate and semi-literate to rest. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your apologetics ministry? What is apologetics? How did you get into it? And what kind of study have you done to make yourself be prepared to answer these kinds of questions?
Okay. Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to start by kind of talking a little bit about how you segued into this with the Brookings report, and then I'll move into the last part. Interestingly, you're talking about in the 1960s, the government, they had this report done, and they thought that a lot of Christians would probably freak out if it was revealed that there were aliens visiting the Earth. In fact, they said it would be electrifying, which is just meaning that it would kind of catch a lot of people off guard and surprise them. And, I still think that would be the case for just about everybody if it was really confirmed. Now, interestingly, since that time, there have been a couple surveys. John Alexander's wife, Victoria Alexander, did one called the Alexander UFO Religious Crisis Survey. And her survey showed that a lot of Christians really wouldn't be all that freaked out, and then they wouldn't lose their faith. That was kind of interesting. And then there's been another one by a Lutheran theologian named Ted Peters, and it's called the Peters Extraterrestrial Intelligence Religious Crisis Survey. And you can find these online, and of course they're footnoted and mentioned in our book. But his survey was similar to the Alexander in that it said that a lot of believers wouldn't have that hard of time of accepting the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence and incorporating it into their existing belief structures. So it says, I think his conclusion was that for the most part, people aren't nearly as prone to freak out as a lot of people have thought. And it was really interesting, though, if you look at that 1960 Brookings report, it said it would be electrifying for fundamentalists. They even said anti-science fundamentalists. And I think they were talking about creationists, basically, who oppose the idea of Darwinian evolution. But it actually made the case that the secular scientists with the naturalistic worldview would be a lot more threatened than the fundamentalists. And I have it right here. It's such a funny conclusion that's contrary to public belief that I thought that it'd be interesting. I'm going to read this really quickly. It says, it has been speculated that of all groups, scientists and engineers might be the most devastated by the discovery of relatively superior creatures, since these professions are most clearly associated with mastery of nature, rather than with the understanding and expression of man. Advanced understanding of nature might vitiate all our theories, and at the very least, if not also require a culture and perhaps a brain inaccessible to Earth scientists. So actually, they would probably be more threatened to lose their authority than anyone else. So I thought that was kind of interesting that it kind of flipped the whole thing around and turned it on the naturalistic scientists themselves. And that's the same Brookings report that everyone cites that says the Christians would freak out. So, when I look at the question of extraterrestrials, though, and this whole, what I see with the UFO phenomenon, I really do consider it a separate issue. These surveys are talking about the existence of a genuine extraterrestrial intelligence. Could God have created other worlds and other beings? I think that's possible, but, I think that God has also given us a revelation in His Word. And, the Bible doesn't mention this subject directly. It doesn't say that aliens exist or they don't exist. It's not really covered. So I'm not making an argument from silence, where the Bible doesn't say anything about them, so therefore they don't exist. The argument that I make is that the Bible does give us a philosophy of history, and it tells us, what to expect in biblical prophecy. It really tells us to be looking forward to the return of Jesus Christ. And it also says right before that return, the time of His return, there's going to be an era of unparalleled deception, that's so great that even the elect might be deceived, it says. And based on what the Bible does say, and the behavior that I see associated with this UFO phenomenon that claims to be alien, but there's really no good evidence for it. We don't see them coming from another planet. We don't really have any evidence that they really are from another world. What we do see is a lot of lies, a lot of deceptions. We see people that are abducted and sexually molested. We see them trying to undermine Christian truth claims. So, what I do see from this phenomenon and the evidence that we do have suggests to me that we're not dealing with space aliens doing science. We're dealing with messengers of deception, like Valet says, who are trying to lead people astray, and that is likely this deception that Jesus was warning about near the time of his return. So, based on what the Bible does say, I don't think that what we are seeing now are genuine extraterrestrials. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist or that perhaps God might have done that. But I think that he would reserve any of that contact until such a time as we're ready for it. And quite frankly, C.S. Lewis wrote that he thought that the distance between the worlds was God's quarantine precautions to keep them away from us, not because they're dangerous, because we are. Because we know that we're fallen. And if you look at the history of human carnage in the 20th century with the world wars, the nuclear explosions, the holocausts that have been perpetrated by human beings, I can see why that might be the case. Now, moving into this area of apologetics, like yourself, I didn't become a Christian until my 30s, and I always had an interest in these sort of subjects. I went to see the movie of Chariots of the Gods in the early 70s when it first played in the theaters. My father actually took it to me. So I've always been interested in these subjects. And it wasn't until I really came to the end of myself and, making my own bad choices that I did turn to Christianity, and I turned my life over to Christ. And it has made a radical difference. Now, without getting into my whole testimony, my testimony is online. I did it with Chris White, and it's available at the Nowhere to Run podcast if anybody's interested in hearing my whole testimony there. But
I'll link to it in the show notes.
Sure. But, God kind of got a hold of me and and gave me the idea that he wanted to use me to minister in these kind of fringe areas where a lot of Christian apologists, a lot of theologians, and the typical Christian authors don't really like to go into these subjects too much. So that's kind of my calling, is to sort of fill in this gap in this area. And that's why I'm particularly interested in your work and your website and the kind of things that you're doing, because it's very similar to my own calling. So instead of just kind of going into that with my background in these sorts of interests, I went to seminary. I got a degree in theological studies, a master's degree. I'm actually still taking classes now. I'm over at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I've taken the Hebrew, a year of Hebrew, a year of Greek. So I'm now working toward an MDiv degree, and I might go further, but I've got a job now, so it's kind of having to sort of figure out what I'm doing with my time. It's getting a little more precious as time goes on, and of course, these books have changed things as well. Tom Horn has really given me an awesome opportunity to get some exposure and get my work out here. So, I've done that. I got an apologetics certificate through Biola University, who has a really outstanding apologetics program going right now. They are what was known as the Bible Institute of Los Angeles that started in the early 20th century under R.A. Torrey. It's now Biola University. They have an excellent apologetics program that I would recommend anyone to do. So, I went out and got some credentials and did some serious study of just biblical theology and theology in general. And, to be able to defend the truth, it really helps to have a good grasp on what it is. And so I've made some effort to do that. And I'm not saying I know it all, but not by a long shot. But, I have done some due diligence to prepare for this ministry before I just jumped in and started writing about aliens and weird stuff. So hopefully I can bring a perspective to it, that incorporates knowledge of these kind of fringe subjects, but then can kind of parse it through a biblical theology.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too, because, for myself, I think that when I changed focus on extraordinary intelligence from sort of a secular view of the supernatural and the paranormal worlds to a biblical view or looking at it through the biblical lens, I think instantly people wanted me to be a Bible scholar and be able to answer all of their most burning questions. And it really made me realize how much more study I personally need to do, because we should all be able to answer these questions. And I've been sort of impressed and sort of touched by how much feedback I've gotten from people who, even in their challenges to my faith and our faith, I get the sense that they just really want to know. Like it's something that maybe comes across as combative, but it actually comes from a place where I think in some ways they're hoping you can give them a reason to believe. And so we did put out this call for people to submit questions, and I found that a lot of the questions that we received were repeated. And I found that interesting. It kind of speaks to what people right now are most concerned about when they question the veracity of Scripture. So if you don't mind, I think just to get as many questions in as possible, let's just dive right into them.
Sure, let's do that.
Okay, so for the most part, I'm going to read these questions as they were submitted so that I'm not injecting my own interpretations into it. And we'll start out with this first one, which was the most submitted inquiry or variations of it that I received, which is, how do you explain the fact that prior to the Bible, there were many crucified saviors or dying and rising Messiah figures that the story of Jesus was based upon? And they give examples of Mithras, Horus, Dionysus, and they claim that these stories show examples of how Christianity borrowed from earlier myths. So let's tackle that one. That's a big one.
Okay, I was kind of surprised at how prevalent this idea is, and my suspicion is that it's fueled by a popular internet movie that was called Zeitgeist. I think that probably popped up around 2005 or something like that. This is known as the pagan copycat hypothesis. Truthfully, it has been thoroughly discredited by actual scholarship. I mean, the internet is probably full of various websites by snarky skeptics and atheists advocating this idea, but they all inevitably are using material from one or two sources. And the most popular is this atheist who goes by the pseudonym Archaea S. I think she's actually a female. And she actually just borrowed, she didn't really do much original research, but there was a 19th century skeptic who kind of pioneered this idea, and he wrote a book, and she has written several books under several different names, I believe, kind of repeating the same idea. And she cites his book as her source. Now, that's the thing that's really interesting, is that when you actually look at the actual texts from the religions themselves, say like Horus from Egypt, the actual similarities are very superficial when you examine the actual source documents from the actual religions. So like with Horus, they say that Horus was crucified and resurrected. But if you look at the Egyptian text, Horus is never said to be crucified. This was just manufactured out of whole cloth. If you look at the original source documents. But nevertheless, movies like Zeitgeist will say that Horus was crucified and resurrected, but that's not even true. When you look at the original documents, the Egyptians kind of had a couple different stories about Horus and Osiris, but typically his father, Osiris, was dismembered by Set, who was jealous and cut his body up into little pieces and threw him down into the bottom of the Nile River. And then Isis journeys into the underworld, collects all of the pieces of him, and then has sex with him. And this is how Horus is conceived. And so Horus is basically the son of Osiris that Isis has. And he's so he is actually, this is their parallel to the resurrection. As you can see, it bears no similarity to the Christian story whatsoever. Osiris is never even resurrected because he's still in the underworld. And if you look at Egyptian paintings of him, he's green. That's because he's a dead body. So Horus is born, and he sets about avenging his father. But this has hardly any similarity to the Christian story whatsoever. And so this is the actual story that these pagan copycat people are claiming that Jesus was based on, but it's completely dubious. There's my friend Chris White actually did a thing called the Zeitgeist Challenge, where he actually offered money if anybody could back up any of the claims in that movie with actual, references to the original source documents, not putting Archaea S as their footnote, but actually go into the documents from those religions themselves. For instance, Mithras. A lot of people try to claim Mithras, but they don't know hardly anything about Mithras from the first century. There's very little documentation from the original Mithras cults. All the data that we have about the Mithras cults in Rome at the time of the New Testament comes 300 or 400 years later, the earliest writings we have. So they're after Christianity. So it's pretty clear that people in the Mithras cult were probably basing some of their beliefs. They were copying Christianity. So it's actually not older, it's newer. But some of these pagan copycat people will try to represent it as older, but they don't really have any documentation for that. They're just kind of manufacturing this idea and putting it forth. So you don't really see the crucified saviors and dying and rising Messiah figures. This is largely the invention of some skeptics who just kind of manufactured these ideas. And another important fact to keep in mind that a lot of these people don't account for is that there are probably around 300 or so detailed messianic prophecies regarding the life, death, and ministry of Jesus Christ that are recorded in the Old Testament. Now, these prophecies probably span from 450 to 1,500 years before his birth. So the accusation that Christians are plagiarizing accounts of other figures in the first century really ignores the fact that concepts like the virgin birth, the resurrection, the Father and the Son relationship, they precede most of these alleged mythological figures by thousands of years in the prophecies. So it also ignores this wealth of prophecy and the fact that, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls that show that these things were written down hundreds of years before Jesus. So he actually, fulfills prophecies that have a lot of these details that they're saying are copied that go back way before the mythological pagan figures ever were even written down. There's several websites. I would recommend Chris White's documentary, Zeitgeist Debunked. He goes into a lot of this in detail and explains it. But, this idea just has really been discredited.
I think it kind of goes to the fact that we're living in an age where there's just a whole lot of armchair internet scholars, who kind of take the surface of what research they can do as fact rather than digging a little deeper or looking for an opposing viewpoint. So
also, there's a website, a friend of mine, Ashley, it's called the divineevidence.com, and I think she misspelled divine in the URL, so it's the DEVINE evidence. So the divineevidence.com, and she has a whole section on Jesus similarities. So that website actually links to the original source material that's on the internet. So like when you read about Horus, she provides a link where you can actually go and read translations of the actual Egyptian stories yourself and verify all this stuff. So the divineevidence.com.
That's perfect. And I think all of that transitions really well into the next question, which is how can you expect people to believe in the Bible if it only testifies to itself? In other words, they're saying that there is no evidence for what takes place in the Bible, particularly the New Testament, and we're just supposed to take the Bible's word for itself without any proof. So I think this is kind of just going to what proof is there that there is even any truth in the Bible? Well, that's a big question.
Yeah, the presumption, if the Bible only testifies to itself, is false. The Bible's confirmed by all sorts of external evidence. But, also, when we talk about the Bible as this monolithic book that we have today, it's probably an inappropriate idea when you're thinking about doing a historical investigation like this, because it's actually a collection of 66 books by 40 different authors written over a period of 1,200 years or so. So the fact that there's a remarkably cohesive narrative running between these 66 different books is is actually good evidence that that it's true. The fact that we have an accurately preserved text is well attested as well. It's interesting that the Old Testament, up until the 1940s, the oldest copy that we had was the Masoretic text, and that was from around 1000 A.D. Literally, we had copies of the New Testament that were older than the Jewish scriptures because of the fact that the Romans, when they sacked Jerusalem in AD 70, they burned the temple down, burning all the old scrolls and everything that the Jews had. But then they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s, and so then we have copies of most of the Old Testament books that are dated back to at least 200 BC or so. And the fact that they were copies of copies of copies in 200 BC shows that they're actually much older. When we compare the text of, say, the Isaiah scroll found in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Masoretic text from 1000 AD, the texts are remarkably cohesive. They're very similar. In fact, the only differences, are like a word here or there, or punctuation, or spelling. The content of the books is absolutely, it's the same. So, the idea, a lot of people also kind of spread this idea that the Bible's been translated so many times that it's, been watered down or adulterated, or we can't trust it because, it's been through so many different hands over so much time. Well, it's just not true, because here we have a copy from 200 BC and we compare it to one in 1000 AD, and there's hardly any difference. So that's a really good piece of evidence that we're dealing with. We have a pure text that hasn't been substantively changed. And, we have New Testament copies that go back to the 2nd century. I think that there recently was an announcement they found a copy of the Gospel of Mark that dates to the 1st century. So literally the time of Jesus, somewhere around, I think around 70 AD or so, somewhere in that range, they have a Gospel of Mark. Now, this is still, it hasn't really been published yet, but one of the New Testament scholars, Daniel Wallace, mentioned it in a debate recently. So that's interesting, being that the oldest New Testament manuscript we had up until then was a little piece of the Gospel of John that was dated at around 120 AD, which is pretty good considering that most scholars think John was written around 90. So it was really only 30 years after the original, which is pretty good. But the archaeology has been confirming the historical reliability of the Bible for hundreds of years. So I don't know where some of these people get these questions. That there's no evidence for the events in the Bible. I don't even know where that comes from, because since the 19th century, when archaeology became a science, it didn't really exist before that. Archaeology is a relatively new field compared to other areas of study. But it really started as people looking into the biblical history and digging around the Middle East. That's really what got archaeology going. Now, 19th century skeptics, thought all sorts of things. They thought the Bible was largely a work of fiction, but every time they dug something up, it seemed to confirm, the existence of people like the Hittites. You can read, things from the 19th century where they didn't think the Hittites existed. They accused the Old Testament authors of making them up, and then they just found all these tablets full of Hittite stuff. And that has been going on for ages now. Skeptics thought Pontius Pilate in the Gospels was a fictional character because they couldn't find any Roman records that really mentioned him. So you can find, the skeptics writing this in the 20th century. Plenty of them were talking about it. And then in 1961, while excavating an ancient theater, I think that was built by Herod, they discovered a large limestone monument bearing the name Pontius Pilate, Perfect of Judea, just as the Gospels had claimed all along. So, there's been a lot of people that have investigated the claims of the New Testament. In fact, the Gospel of Luke is known as one of the greatest historians of all time. There's entire books based on Luke's descriptions of the cities and the areas that they walked through, because archaeologists have gone through and confirmed many of the details that Luke included in his Gospel. So there's a lot of good documentation that Luke's descriptions are very accurate and historical. So there's a lot of confirmation on the historicity of these accounts. The same sort of thing occurred with King David. A lot of skeptics have claimed that they're called biblical minimalists, and these are kind of the really skeptical archaeologists and the people that just don't want to accept that there's any truth to the Bible's version of ancient history. So they assume that King David was a mythological figure that the Jews just invented to give themselves, somebody like King Arthur or something like that. They kind of thought of it that way. And this has been going on. It's still going on in some circles. But in 1993, they discovered what they call the Tel Dan Stele. Now, you've heard of the tribe of Dan in Judaism. In that area, a stele is just an inscribed rock. It's an inscribed stone. And Tel mound that they dig into, it's really just layers and layers of ancient stuff kind of built up into a mound. They call that a tel. So the Tel Dan Stele is an inscribed stone they dug up in the area of Dan in 1993, and it's a stele that was written by a rival king to the Israelites, and he's boasting of his victory over the, quote, house of David, end quote. So this is the first thing they found, that was really ancient that proved that David was a historical figure. And so that was just 1993. So they're still digging stuff up, but every time they dig something up, it disconfirms the skeptical theories and seems to support the veracity of the Bible. And that's kind of, really a lot of external confirmation. But this, that doesn't necessarily prove that we're dealing with the supernatural word of God, and I think that's where a lot of these objections are coming from. People, they don't know, why should I believe this over, a book from Hindus or the Quran or any of these other books. Now, the historical accuracy and the integrity of the text, I think they go a long way to showing that it's basically trustworthy. But how do you know that this is really a revelation from the one true God? What makes this stand out? And I think that what the Bible has that none of these other books have are fulfilled prophecies. Now, I mentioned those a little bit in the last context, but the Bible has very specific historical prophecies that talk about events that you can verify were written down before they happened and came to pass after it was written. This is, anyone who really wants to look into it can do this sort of investigation. Now, I could mention a few. Isaiah 52 and 53, Isaiah 52:13, something like that, through the rest of the chapter of 53, is really a passage that talks about this suffering servant, and it talks about the suffering, death, and resurrection of the, quote, servant of the Lord. Now, it sets forth the role and experience of Jesus of Nazareth with amazing accuracy. And, we have a copy of this that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It dated around between 200 and 100 BC. So, at least 100 years, probably more before Jesus. We have a copy of it. Now, we think it was probably written around 700 to 600 BC is when Isaiah lived. Now, the language in Isaiah 53, if anyone reads it, you can see it talks about the humble circumstances of his birth, that he grows up. It indicates that his countrymen would despise and reject him, that he's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, that he would be pierced for the sins of the people, which is really unheard of considering Isaiah's writing, in the 7th century BC. They didn't crucify anybody. The idea that someone would be pierced for our sins was really an alien concept to Judaism. Yet there it is. Psalm 22, Jesus quotes that on the cross. If you read that, it's an astounding account of what happened on the cross. But this passage in Isaiah, it goes even further. It says that all mankind's gone astray for sin. It says that he would suffer on our behalf, that he would suffer for the sins of the people. So you see most of New Testament doctrine about Jesus forecast in the Old Testament, hundreds of years before it came to pass. Now, a clever skeptic might say, well, Chris, so the apostles just read the Old Testament and wrote the Gospels to say that Jesus fulfilled all these things. So that would be the typical comeback, that they just kind of made it seem like he fulfilled it. the problem with that idea is that you can look at secular records that mention Jesus and confirm some of these details from Roman historians and from Josephus, a Jewish historian. Interestingly, Tacitus talked about Jesus being crucified. He was a Roman historian. So the fact that he would be crucified, that's confirmed not only in the Gospels by the apostles, but by a Roman historian. Josephus talks about it. So there's external sources to the New Testament that verify that these things actually happened. So they weren't just made up. A lot of history wouldn't make any sense if Jesus was not a historical figure and these things didn't actually happen. You think about how fundamental it is, even to like the way we even keep time. We have BC and AC and AD, and this whole concept. It's just too big of a deal in history for it to not to be based on, something real in history. I don't think that any actual historian would argue that Jesus was mythological. Now, there's some kind of fringe atheist types that try to argue that, but none of them are taken seriously. And even the atheist history professors in colleges would never make such a fallacious argument. So, you see this prophecy in Isaiah that really describes Jesus to a T. In Daniel chapter 9, in the book of Daniel, there's a famous prophecy called the 70 weeks. Now, I'm not going to try to go through all the math, but no matter, and you can calculate this thing. There's a couple different ways of doing it, and there's some people that debate it. But what nobody disputes is that this prophecy nails the time period of Jesus appearing in his ministry to the Jewish people around 30 A.D. It nails it very accurately. This was written in the 6th century B.C. It talks about a certain time period from when the order to rebuild Jerusalem. And you can do the math. There's several places on the internet, I'm sure, that have this all laid out. But it's called the 70 weeks prophecy. And it's pretty precise, and it nails it right down to when Jesus would appear. It says that the Messiah, the Prince, would be cut off, and then the city of Rome would be destroyed. And so this is all in the book of Daniel, and that's exactly what happened. 35 years or so after Jesus was crucified, Titus Vespasian came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. So I'm sorry if I said Rome a minute ago, I meant Jerusalem. Rome destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, and Daniel predicts that. So I think that, the way that you can see that the Bible is a supernatural revelation is that it writes history in advance. And I've just given you just a little brief snippet off the top of my head, but there are tons of prophecies in the Old Testament that have come to pass. The one about Tyre, it actually predicted that Alexander the Great would scrape the city of Tyre clean and build a land bridge, and he did that. So I would recommend a study of biblical prophecy, fulfilled prophecies that really do demonstrate that the Bible is a unique book among religious texts.
And I think that's a great place to start, because for me, learning about fulfilled prophecy is what really kind of opened my heart a little bit to the supernatural aspects of the Bible and the truth of the Bible. It's pretty fascinating when you dig into it. And speaking of the supernatural aspects of the Bible, which, it's a supernatural book, really, for the sake of time, I'm going to combine a few of these questions because they kind of all speak to the same thing, which is a lot of people are asking about hell. We've had questions like, if God is all loving, then why is hell eternal? Questions about, did everyone who lived before Jesus go to hell? And then how if people have never heard of Jesus, will they go to hell? So maybe we can combine some of those questions into a larger picture.
Okay. Well, the issue of hell, is particularly a thorny question. And, I'm not going to say that, I know who's going to go to hell and who's not going to go to hell myself. I'm not going to answer that from my own authority. All I can do is appeal to Scripture. And, it's interesting to me that you don't see much about hell until it comes to Jesus. Nearly all the stuff that you see in the Bible about hell comes from the words of Jesus himself. I think that that's intentional. I think that it is such a distasteful and such a scary topic, one that evokes such strong feelings in people, that God really reserved that to let Jesus, who was the ultimate incarnation of someone who came to lay down his life for us, he let Jesus give all the harsh words and all the harsh teaching about hell. Jesus said things like, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, because it would be better to enter into heaven with one eye than to go to hell. What was he doing? Was he really telling us to gouge our eyes out? No. He's using an extreme example to make a point about how serious sin is, about how serious hell is. I think that the biblical descriptions of hell are very serious. We're talking about eternal separation from God. Does that mean that they're really literal flames that you're roasting on? I don't necessarily think that's the case, but I think it might even be worse than that in the long run. I see things about hell being a place of eternal darkness, yet at the same time it has fire. And those two things don't seem to work together too well if you take it at a really woodenly literal approach. But, I don't think it really matters whether the flames are real or not. I think that the regret is absolutely as bad as burning is what it's getting at. And, that's just kind of my take on it. Now, people ask, if the people in the remote jungle of Africa or South America or some other remote place, and they never hear the gospel, are they going to go to hell? Well, I don't know, but I think that seems to be the case. And, that on the surface, as a human being, that bothers me. That doesn't seem fair. I understand why people want to ask that question, but it really comes down to accepting this idea that none of us deserve salvation. God's under no obligation to save anyone. So, perhaps we should be asking the question, how can a righteous and holy God allow any of us to be in his presence? And if that really bothers you, perhaps you should become a missionary and take the gospel to these unreached people groups. The Apostle Paul wrote in the book of Romans, how can they call on him who they've not believed, and how can they believe in him they've never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? So if that's really something that bothers you and that's a passion that really burns at you, then I would encourage you to become a missionary. That's really what drives missions, because there are a lot of people that don't hear the gospel. Now, I think that salvation is only found in believing the gospel. We're all made in the image of God. Human beings have the ability to make choices that have a moral dimension to them. We can choose to do or say things that are right or wrong. This ability, of course, is what allows us to make wrong choices, and that's really where evil comes from. Now, when you read the Bible, God didn't start out this way. There was a perfect creation, and man chose to disobey, and that's really what has brought things into this state of affairs. So people ask, why doesn't God just destroy the devil, or, why is this still going on? Well, the way I see it, if you look at the book of Job, you see that Job goes through all these horrible sufferings and things, and Job's friends all think that it's something that Job did, but we kind of get an inside look at the beginning of the book, where we actually see that this is some kind of wager going on between God and Satan, and there's a behind the scenes backstory that Job and his friends are not aware of. So when it comes right down to it, it wasn't even necessarily about anything that Job had done. It was a matter of him proving his faithfulness. Now, I think this has a lot of explanatory scope and that this life, this brief life on earth, in light of eternity, our lifetime on earth is minuscule. I think it's a proving ground. I think it really is a test. Are you going to acknowledge and worship God, or are you going to submit your life to Him, or are you going to assume that you know best, and do your own thing? I think that we have choices that we're presented with. I think that it's kind of a development program. I think that there's something to be learned through the choices that we have to make, and that God is using these experiences for something that has eternal significance. In light of eternity, it's a very brief life, but the decisions that we make do have eternal ramifications. Now, this idea that people before Jesus, did they go to hell? Well, I don't think that's the case at all. If you look at the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, it explains that people were saved by faith looking forward. It talks about Abraham and Moses and a lot of the Old Testament saints. And there's also some mysteries in the Old Testament that suggest God was doing things that we're not really told about. Melchizedek is a priest. He's mentioned in Genesis 14, introduced as the king of Salem, the priest of the God Most High. So, there's a priest of the true God, but we don't know anything about him or the people of Salem or the history of any of that. Also, when Moses, after he ran from Egypt and he ended up in the mountains watching the flocks for Jethro, Jethro is described as the priest of Midian, and apparently he knew Yahweh as well. But we don't know anything about Midian or the history of how he became a priest or any of that. So we can't really assume that we know everything that God's done in the ancient past. But it's clear from the book of Hebrews chapter 11 that people in the Old Testament were saved by their faith looking forward to the future.
Okay, so for our last question, we have something submitted from a young lady, and she says that she's Catholic and she loves Jesus. She believes in John 3:16, but she questions whether or not Catholics, the accusation is that Catholics are not saved because of their beliefs. She references Revelation 5:8 about praying to the saints. She references Luke 1:42 where it says of Mary, "Blessed art thou amongst women." She's essentially putting forward a argument for some of the more mystical aspects of Catholicism and wants to know, how is it that you can say that there's no truth to these things? She believes that they are biblical.
Well, salvation is found only by believing the gospel that Jesus died for our sins, was buried, rose from the dead. This message is received by faith alone. We can't do anything. We can't add works to this, to what Christ has done. If you believe that you're a sinner, that you've been saved by no merit of your own, that rather the shed blood of Christ on your behalf, then I believe you're saved. However, you have to understand that according to traditional Catholic theology, that's not enough. According to Catholic theology, you have to be baptized by the Catholic Church. You have to be in good standing with the Catholic Church and in a state of grace through doing good works, attending confession and Mass, or at the, just these things just to qualify, or if you don't have those things in line, you're either going to have to spend a lot of time in purgatory to work them off, or you're not saved at all. Depending on what era of Catholic theology you look at, you're going to get different ideas about that. But I don't see anything in the New Testament about purgatory or any of these ideas that you have to be in submission to the Pope, or that baptism removes the guilt of original sin. These are all alien ideas to biblical theology that the Catholic Church has added. So, I think there are Catholics that are saved, but it's not because of Catholic theology. It's actually in spite of it. Now, Revelation 5:8 does not say anything about saints bringing our prayers to the Father. In fact, it's really anachronistic. Revelation 5:8 says, "And when he had taken up the scroll," he's talking about Jesus, "the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are prayers of the saints." Now, in the New Testament, the word saints just refers to Christians. It's just believers. Everybody's a saint. I'm a saint. Natalina is a saint. Anybody that is A saved believer in Christ is a saint. When John wrote the book of Revelation, there was no Catholic Church. There was no such thing as a Catholic saint. That came many hundreds of years later. Now, the verse doesn't even say that the saints carry our prayers at all. It says that the golden bowls full of incense are the prayers of the saints. So I think the idea there is that our prayers are kind of stored up in heaven. It doesn't say anything that we are supposed to pray to dead human beings. If you look in the Old Testament, that's called necromancy. We're actually forbidden to try to contact dead human beings, and saints are just human beings that are deceased. So that is no justification for us to try to communicate with the dead, which is really what mediums do. And I don't know how this practice became so prevalent in Catholicism, but it is absolutely antithetical to biblical theology. Now, as far as Mary, Luke 1:42 says that she's blessed among women. Yeah, because she got the supreme honor of giving birth to the Messiah. And I think that's all it means. In the same chapter of Luke, Mary says, "And my spirit rejoices in God my Savior." Now, sinless, perpetual virgins don't need a Savior. Only sinners need a Savior. And Mary says that God is her Savior. Now, it's clear to me in the gospel accounts that Mary had other children by Joseph. Jesus has brothers and sisters. The Catholic worship of Mary is basically idolatry, and prayers to Mary are falling straight to the ground. And the fact that they encourage people to pray to Mary is really promoting Mary to godlike capability. Think about this. Is Mary God? How can Mary hear the simultaneous prayers of millions of Catholics at the same time? In fact, how can the saints hear thousands and thousands of Catholics praying at the same time? Are they gods? Can't they see that they're making deities out of deceased human beings? They're really breaking the commandment to have no other gods before the true and living God. Now, in Catholicism, they say Mary is the mediatrix. Literally, she's the mediator between God and man. They say that Mary made atonement for the sins of man. This is in a Catholic theology book. They preach about Mary. They worship Mary. This is idolatry. Scripture is very clear. In 1 Timothy, it says there's one God and there's one mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ. Now, they've made Mary a mediator. They've made Mary a redeemer. They've really usurped the unique role of Christ by deifying Mary. So the worship of Mary is idolatry. And if you're engaging in that, you really need to do some serious reflection. You've been led astray.
Okay, and now just for time's sake, I think that's probably all the questions we're going to get to. And I think that with all of the questions that we received, everything that you have said kind of goes to answering the majority of what we've received. So I hope that it helps some of the listeners out there. And I do hope that the people who submitted questions are listening and will have a chance to absorb some of what Cris has said. And on that note, Cris, I just really want to thank you not only for taking the time to talk to us about some of your work, but for taking the time to answer some of these questions, because really that's what it's all about. We should be able to answer the questions that non-believers put to us or that seekers put to us. So I really am appreciative of you taking the time to do that, and I know that our listeners are as well.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to have an opportunity to talk about these things. I don't really take any pleasure in disagreeing with some of these ideas, but I'm just stating the truth as clearly as I see it laid out in the New Testament. These aren't just my ideas. I've done quite a bit of research. There's a whole chapter devoted to Catholic theology and belief in Mary in the book Petrus Romanus. As far as these other issues, there's a wide variety of Christian scholarship and answers on some of these things, and these are just the truth is best as I can see it, and I've done my best to give you an answer I think that is biblical and clear. But it's been my pleasure to be on the show with you, and I just want to encourage you in the work that you're doing, and addressing some of these topics that the traditional church tries to kind of avoid, but there are a lot of people in our culture are interested in. And I'm working on a book right now called The Supernatural Worldview that's going to address a lot of these things as well. And in fact, I'm interviewing Natalina for that to kind of get her back for all this interviewing she's doing of me here. So hopefully we should have that out sometime in the fall.
Well, we're looking forward to it. And again, I thank you so much, and I hope we can have you on again sometime.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay, thanks, Cris. Well, if you're like me, at this point, your brain is bursting with information and knowledge and understanding and education, and you're probably even eager to jump into doing your own research and verifying some of the things that Cris said. So certainly I am just over the moon that Cris decided to take the time to not only discuss his books and his work, but also to discuss, to answer some of these questions that people have put forward, and he's certainly qualified to do so, and I think that he did a really great job. We didn't get to all the questions, time only permitted to cover what we did do, but I think it's good because, sometimes you can only absorb so much information at any one time, so maybe we'll have to have him on again to address those that were left over, or maybe even some follow-up questions. But what we did discuss, I think, actually kind of covered the entirety of the sort of spirit of the questions that were even remaining. So what I'm going to really direct you to do as soon as you're done listening is to head over to extraordinaryintelligence.com, or maybe you're already there, and take a look at the show notes, because I've put Chris's sources in there that he provided throughout the course of the interview. And then right at the top, I'm including a link to Cris Putnam's testimony, because I think it is really, really crucial to understanding where this man is coming from. His testimony is very intense. It's very emotional, and it really is moving, because it shows that really you can't be too bad. You can't be too sinful. You can't be too rebellious for Jesus to accept you. I mean, there's not a sin quota where all of a sudden the Lord's going to say, well, no, this guy here, he pushed it too far. I don't want him. Impossible. And that's the same goes for my lifestyle prior to being saved in my story. Cris was very deeply involved in addiction and rebellion, and he was in a very dark place. And it wasn't until he was in his 30s that he came into fellowship with the Lord. And it's really exciting, because it paints such a beautiful picture of the old man versus the new man, and how really, when you look at Cris Putnam's life prior to being saved, and you look at Natalina's life prior to being saved, it's night and day. It is an illustration of the old self just passing away and entering into this wonderful new. Of course, everybody still has their struggles, and it's a process, and not everybody's experience is the same. But I mean, truly, he changes you. He changes your heart. He changes your mind. He changes your desires. He just lifts you out of that really dark place. And to that end, I also want you to go and check out, I have a friend named Jennifer, and she has a website called ourcrossroads.com. This entire site is her personal account of struggling with addiction, and it's her whole path from addiction to recovery. And she struggled tremendously, not unlike Cris. She struggled with addiction, and she struggled with rebellion, and it wasn't until, she went through everything, going to recovery and relapsing, and going to recovery and relapsing, and it wasn't until she let Jesus help her and she surrendered to him
that her life completely changed. Again, it is such a wonderful portrait of how the old man versus the new man, how you definitely become a new person when you do surrender all of yourself to him, and he will change you, and he's faithful to do that. And it doesn't matter how you lived your life up until that point, because you will be forgiven for that, and you'll be washed clean. And I just encourage you to, if you're struggling with addiction, I encourage you to do 3 things. 1, I encourage you to accept Jesus Christ into your life. And 2, I encourage you to listen to Cris Putnam's testimony that I'm going to be linking in the show notes. And 3, I'm going to encourage you to check out Jennifer's site and read her inspirational stories of how different her life is now. I mean, she really went from someone who struggled in a horrible way, crippled by her addiction, to now she's happy and vibrant, and she's getting married, and she has a good job, and she's involved in prison ministry and helping other people who are struggling. And I think there's something that happens, especially when you're like someone who comes into, whether you're just coming into the faith or you're coming into the fullness of your faith as an adult, that really makes you want to just get out there and grab people by their shirt sleeves and say to them, you know, hey, I realize you've lived a life of sin. I realize you've got a whole lifetime of rebellion and trouble behind you. But it doesn't matter. You're still worthy. You're still valuable to him, and he wants you, and he's worthy of your praise. And if you would just humble yourself and ask him to help you, he will. He's faithful to do that. He will change you. And these are just a few of the stories that serve as examples of that. So, on that note, when I leave next week for my little mini vacay that I'm taking across the plains of North Dakota, I will be back probably sometime Friday, and at that point I'm hopefully going to be able to record another show, but it might not be released until the following week. And I realize that I really intended to keep on a intense schedule of releasing these new podcasts every Friday, but what I ended up doing was starting my podcast during probably the most hectic point in my life. Leave it to me, right? Where I couldn't possibly adhere to the schedule that I had set up for myself. So the release of these podcasts have been a little schizophrenic, and, well, not schizophrenic, that's not the word I meant to use. Sporadic is actually what I meant to say, but, you know, I suppose both could be true. But I hope that after I return from my vacation, we'll be able to be on a little bit more of a legitimate schedule of releasing new shows every Friday. But until that point, you can just wait with bated breath for the next episode of Beyond Extraordinary, which will be coming at some point in the future. Ideally, I will have a new show to release next weekend, but it'll probably take you just as long, if not longer, to let this show sink in, to absorb the content of this program. So on that note, I encourage you to check out all of the latest that we have to share on extraordinaryintelligence.com. I try to update it with new information and new articles pretty regularly. This weekend I will be setting up a special place on the site just dedicated to the podcast, so that with one click you can access the archives, which right now the archives are 2 programs, by the way. Some of you have been asking if I can put the show up on iTunes, and I am in the process of trying to do that. And I do have an RSS feed directly to the podcast as well. And I recommend that you sign up for that, and also just subscribe directly to extraordinaryintelligence.com so that you don't miss a thing, my friends. You can go to the subscribe link in the upper right hand corner of the screen when you're on the website, and it will whisk you away to a place where you can subscribe via email, where you'll get an email every time I update the site, or you can subscribe in a reader, whatever that means. That's not something that I do. I mean, I get what it is, but do people really do that? I don't know. But anyway, the option is there for you if that is something that you do. And of course, there are a few things you can really do to help Extraordinary Intelligence and Beyond Extraordinary out. The first of which would be that we could definitely use your prayers. We still struggle with a few things lingering from when we were hacked a little over a year ago. Some issues we're trying to work out that are eluding us a bit. So just some prayers that we can get to the root of some of those problems and figure out what's going on in the back end there. The site functions just fine. It's a few background issues that we're trying to figure out. And then, of course, if you see something on Extraordinary Intelligence that you like, that appeals to you, that moves you in some way, just share it. Share it via Facebook or Twitter or whatever. I mean, that really, really helps us a lot. And then finally, if you feel moved that you'd like to help us financially, we do have a way that you can do that. It's in the right-hand corner of the website. And you'll see the donate button just through PayPal. And if that's something you feel moved to do, it helps with covering server expenses and equipment and setting up a fund essentially to possibly take the show live, which I would like to do, but of course there are expenses involved with all of that. Or you can shop at my little store, extraordinaryboutique.com, where I sell a lot of my handmade jewelry and a few other odds and ends, and all of that goes back into the big old extraordinary pot. So, if you feel moved to help us in any way, that is of course greatly appreciated. And on that note, I'm just going to sign off by saying thank you so much for all of your support and for all of the wonderful feedback that we've received, and even the critical feedback. It all helps us grow and change and evolve and this type of thing. So enjoy your weekend or your week, whenever it happens to be that you're listening to this, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye. God bless.
You've been listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina. For the latest headlines and program schedule, please visit extraordinaryintelligence.com.